It is the 25th of May, 1979. At Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Captain Walter Lux settles into the left seat of DC-10 registered N110AA and begins his pre-flight checks. To his right sits First Officer James Dillard, and behind them, Flight Engineer Alfred Udovich works through his own instrument panel. The three of them move through the checklist with the efficiency of men who have done this hundreds of times, confirming hydraulics, verifying engine parameters, clearing every item line by line. In the cabin behind them, 10 flight attendants prepare 258 passengers for departure. Among them, a number of aviation professionals traveling to an air show in Los Angeles. Everything checks out. Every indicator reads normal. At 1502 hours local time, Captain Lux advances the throttles, and Flight 191 begins its takeoff roll. Nothing about that moment suggested it would be anything other than routine. The aircraft accelerated through its marks, lifted cleanly from the runway, and climbed normally. For approximately 3 seconds, everything was fine. Then, the left engine separated.
Engine number 1 and its pylon tore away from the wing, flipped over the leading edge, and fell back onto the runway. In the same instant, hydraulic lines controlling the left wing slats were severed, the slats retracted, and the left wing stalled. Lux and Dillard had 16 seconds and no warning light for what had been lost. The DC-10 rolled past 90 degrees of bank and struck the ground less than a mile from the runway. All 271 people on board were killed, along with 2 on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident in United States history. But this was not an isolated failure. 5 years earlier, on the 3rd of March 1974, a Turkish Airlines DC-10 had crashed into the Ermenonville forest north of Paris, killing all 346 people on board after a cargo door blew out and collapsed the cabin floor, severing control cables and rendering the aircraft uncontrollable. The door's flaw had been known since 1970, flagged after a near-identical incident over Windsor, Ontario in 1972, and reported directly to the manufacturer. McDonnell Douglas made partial changes. The FAA chose not to issue a mandatory directive, reaching instead an informal agreement that left compliance voluntary.
In Chicago, the cause was different, but the pattern was the same. The pylon had been fractured during a maintenance procedure 2 months before the accident, when mechanics used a forklift to remove the engine assembly in a way that directly contradicted the manufacturer's own instructions. The damage was not detected, it was not reported, and the aircraft continued flying scheduled routes until the morning of the 25th of May. 2 crashes, 5 years apart, and the same institutional signature running through both of them. The DC-10 was not unfixable. The fixes had existed, but decisions had been made to delay them, and passengers and pilots paid the price. The DC-10 was a plane built to be first. In the mid-1960s, American Airlines put forward a specification for a wide-body jet capable of flying long-range routes from shorter runways, and 2 manufacturers answered, McDonnell Douglas with the DC-10 and Lockheed with the L-1011 TriStar. The aircraft were nearly identical in configuration, targeted the same carriers, and competed for the same orders. But Lockheed was struggling. Its chosen engine, the Rolls-Royce RB211, was behind schedule and pushing Rolls-Royce toward bankruptcy, and the TriStar's advanced systems were taking longer to develop than anticipated. McDonnell Douglas saw the opening and moved fast, securing launch orders from American Airlines and United Airlines in 1968 and pressing the DC-10 through development at a pace driven as much by competitive urgency as by engineering readiness. The DC-10 made its maiden flight on the 29th of August 1970 and entered commercial service the following year. The TriStar would not fly commercially until 1972. McDonnell Douglas had won the race to market, but the rush had left something unfixed inside the aircraft, and the people who knew about it were not all in a position to say so.
That something was the cargo door. The Flaw had surfaced as early as 1970 during ground testing when an outward-opening cargo door blew out in a pressurization test and collapsed the main cabin floor. A dispute emerged between McDonnell Douglas and Convair, the subcontractor responsible for the fuselage, over what changes were necessary, and Convair was forbidden from contacting the FAA directly regardless of the severity of its concerns. By 1972, Convair had internally concluded in a formal memo that the inadequate resolution of the Flaw would likely result in the loss of an aircraft. As we already know, that prediction came true twice. The first time, over Windsor in 1972, everyone survived. The NTSB found the design dangerously flawed and recommended mandatory modifications, but what followed instead was a gentleman's agreement between the head of the FAA and the head of McDonnell Douglas's aircraft division, under which partial changes were made and no airworthiness directive was issued. Airlines were not required to comply, and so 22 months later, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 departed Paris-Orly with a cargo door that appeared secure but was not, closed by a baggage handler who spoke neither Turkish nor English, the only languages in which the warning notice about the known flaw had been written. The investigation confirmed what Convair had already documented 2 years earlier. The flaw had been known, and the aircraft had been allowed to keep flying. To address the Paris disaster, mandatory door modifications were applied across the entire DC-10 fleet, and for several years those changes held. The institutional pattern that had allowed the door flaw to persist had not been corrected, only interrupted. And on the 25th of May, 1979, it surfaced again at Chicago O'Hare, this time in the pylon of the left engine, fractured 2 months earlier during a maintenance procedure that went undetected and unreported. The result was 273 dead, the FAA's suspension of the DC-10's type certificate on the 6th of June, 1979, and a 37-day ban on all DC-10 operations in American airspace. Because of that grounding and the public apprehension that followed, orders collapsed, and McDonnell Douglas announced in August 1983 that production would end. The final aircraft was delivered to Nigeria Airways in July 1989, and the program had not broken even. But the crashes were not finished. On the 19th of July, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 suffered an uncontained tail engine failure at Sioux City, Iowa, that simultaneously disabled all 3 hydraulic systems and killed 112 people. Because all 3 systems shared the same physical space beneath the tail engine, a design assumption that had been considered virtually impossible to trigger. The crew saved 184 lives through extraordinary airmanship, but the accident confirmed that the DC-10's vulnerabilities had not been fully understood, even by the people who built it. A combination of 3 major disasters, hundreds of fatalities, and a regulatory record that showed warnings ignored and fixes delayed earned the DC-10 a name that spread through newsrooms, airports, and cockpits alike: the Death Cruiser. Passengers began requesting alternative aircraft on routes where the DC-10 was scheduled, and some refused to board it entirely. Pilots filed concerns through union channels, and those with enough seniority used it to avoid DC-10 assignments altogether. Northwest Airlines flew the last major passenger service on the 8th of January 2007, and Biman Bangladesh Airlines completed the type's final scheduled commercial flight on the 20th of February 2014. The DC-10 retiring not with the legacy McDonnell Douglas had intended, but with one shaped entirely by what its worst moments had revealed: that the systems designed to protect passengers had failed more than once, not because the problems were unknown, but because the decisions had been made to look away. I'm just one person putting this together, so if I missed something or got a detail wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments. I read through them, and I value clear, informed input. Share your thoughts, and let's keep the discussion respectful. If you find this kind of detailed aviation analysis useful, you can subscribe.